Text this morning is from 2 Timothy 2. Paul writes, "You therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Jesus Christ. And the things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. You therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. And also, if anyone competes in athletics, he is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. The hardworking farmer must be first to partake of the crops. Consider what I say, and may the Lord give you understanding in all these things. Remember that Jesus Christ, of the seed of David, was raised from the dead according to my gospel." Paul wrote to instruct Timothy, his son in the faith. He wrote to instruct him on how to lead the young church in Ephesus. And amid those instructions, there were these words of encouragement: be strong in the grace of Christ Jesus. In other words, another translation, be empowered in the grace of Jesus Christ. Be empowered to do the work that you've been called to do. And these words must have meant a lot to the young pastor Timothy, especially given the difficulty of the situation that he faced there in Ephesus. One of Timothy's primary tasks is to commit these things to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Timothy's job is to hand down what he's been given from Paul, the apostolic teaching. In chapter 1, Paul calls it the pattern of sound words, to which Timothy has been entrusted by Paul. Sound, not a word that we use much anymore, simply means healthy, wholesome, as in that old Greek saying, sound mind, sound body. Paul's teaching was sound because it was teaching that led to health, to wholeness. In the words of the Torah, which Paul would have read, this is the way which leads to life. In the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, this pattern of sound teaching is called the tradition. Tradition is simply a Latin word which means handing down, traditio. And that's what Paul is doing to Timothy, and what Timothy is tasked to do to the next generation, to pass down, to hand over the sound words about Jesus the Messiah. What could be easier, right? Apparently, there were some in Ephesus who resisted the message of Paul. And this is why we see that third imperative in the text. Be strong, commit these sayings to faithful people, and then the third one, endure suffering. Share in hardship. Timothy isn't just teaching the cradle roll class. He's not just assigning Sunday school roles, but he's teaching in a way that will involve suffering. Now, those of you who put the cradle roll class together may agree that there's suffering there too. I don't know. But Paul has already himself suffered a great deal in this mission. In fact, he's writing this letter from prison. He says to Paul to Timothy, not just to endure suffering, he says, share with me in suffering. Now, it isn't surprising that unbelievers might throw Paul in prison. Unbelievers have always resisted the gospel. The message of Jesus is a threat to the principalities and powers of this world. And yet Paul suffers most not from outsiders, but from his own brothers. 2 Timothy is filled with these men's names. We read last week about Phygellus and Hermogenes, who turned away from Paul. Hymenaeus and Philetus, later in chapter 2, have strayed from the truth. Demas, in the last chapter, has forsaken Paul, having loved the present world. In chapter 1, he says, all in Asia turned away from me. And then in chapter 4, he said, at my first defense, no one stood with me, but all have forsaken me. Which reminds us that that Latin word traditio has a double meaning. It means both to hand over in a positive sense. It also means to betray. And our word traitor comes from tradition as well. Now let's assume for just a minute that these people who are opposing Paul and Timothy aren't bad men. They're good men, ordinary men, men who have been baptized and accepted the way of Jesus. More than that, these are all men who have made sacrifices. They've gone into the ministry. Demas, we know from the book of Philemon, was one of Paul's fellow workers. And undoubtedly, each of these men have their own story and their own reasons for parting ways with Paul, reasons which we'll never know. Yet, Paul says they're traitors. They haven't just abandoned him personally, but far worse, he says they've betrayed the gospel of the resurrection. And the source of their betrayal, seemingly, as best we can put back together, the source of their betrayal is that they were ashamed of that gospel. They're embarrassed about Paul who's in prison. Just like if we found out Jeff was in jail, for whatever reason, we would probably be a little embarrassed about that. Paul's ministry, some of these folks seem to believe, was weak and ineffective. Paul lacked strength. He lacked power. Be empowered, he says to Timothy. We don't know much about these opponents except for their names, but their names do tell us a little something about them. All the men Paul mentions here in 2 Timothy have Greek names. Likely they were not Jewish like Paul. And given that he's writing to Timothy in Ephesus, a Greek city, we could take Ephesus as the likely context for where these men are coming from. And we know a little bit about Ephesus from history. Ephesus is a pretty religious city. It's full of respectable churchgoers who hold morality and tradition in high regard. The city houses the temple of the goddess Artemis. You may remember this from Acts 19. The people of Ephesus were very devoted to the goddess Artemis. She's one of the oldest goddesses in the world. Any goddess that can survive that long is bound to have a little bit of power. And she does. Artemis protects the city against enemies. There are a lot of stories in history about this. She provides the people with grain in the yearly harvest. And most importantly, she gave the people meaning and purpose in their lives through the annual festivals and celebrations that honored her. When Paul came to Ephesus and denounced Artemis, back in Acts 19, he wasn't merely replacing a false god with a true one. According to Paul, it wasn't just that the Ephesians were mistaken about the source of divine power. Paul said they're wrong about the nature of divine power. Paul didn't just challenge the worship of Artemis, he challenged the whole concept of religion, which is why he made enemies both among the Gentiles and among his fellow Jews, because his redefinition of religion came as a challenge to both parties. Living in the 21st century, so far away from these events, it's hard to remember that Paul was the one on the outside. Paul was the oddball. Paul was the one with the minority voice, whose views would have been suspicious to most people. Paul's the one who we would be suspicious of. This is why he keeps landing in prison. The things he says are embarrassing. So what is the controversial teaching, the embarrassing thing that Paul is entrusting to Timothy? Well, he sums it up there in chapter 2, verse 8. You ready? Remember this, he says. Remember that Jesus the Messiah of the seed of David was raised from the dead. That's it. Again, this doesn't sound too controversial to us 2,000 years on. Surely, this isn't the kind of thing that would get you thrown into prison. I mean, it may be strange, but not worthy of being thrown into prison. Maybe you say it's the claim that Jesus was divine. Maybe that's what's controversial, and somehow the resurrection is proof of Jesus' divinity. Calling Jesus Son of God would have gotten him in trouble. Well, people back then actually didn't have too much problem calling ordinary men gods. They did it to their own emperor. Nor did they have too much trouble intellectually with the idea of resurrection. Artemis's own daughter, Persephone, was raised from the dead. Coming back from the dead is no big deal. These are gods, after all. They can do what they want to. Gods have power. But Jesus' resurrection signals something different from all the pagan stories. It's a revisioning of divine power, of course, with implications for human power and leadership. God's power is not the power to do whatever God wants. It's not the power to conquer, to triumph, to win. As Paul describes it elsewhere, God's power is the power to suffer, to put up with. It's the power to lose, the power to fail, and the power to be betrayed. Next Sunday, we'll read the story of Jesus' passion in preparation for Easter. The story of his suffering and death. We'll be reminded that he was betrayed by his best friends, stabbed in the back, accused of disrespecting his own God, humiliated in public, and then killed. Jesus was no Artemis. Jesus was a loser. Jesus was embarrassing. The gospel of the resurrection is that God works through loss and failure. Jesus freely gave himself over to others, and it killed him. But God gave him back his life on the third day. The kind of power revealed in Jesus looks a lot like what we call patience. On the one hand, the kind of patience demonstrated in the trial and execution of Jesus can only be called divine. Like a sheep before the slaughter, he opened not his mouth. On the other hand, what Jesus did is not so far removed from our normal experience. It's this relatively small thing which all of us understand. We all know what it means to be patient, and yet it remains so difficult for us to actually do. It's within our grasp, and yet it seems to constantly elude us, whether it's with the kids, or at work, or in the car, in traffic. It's right there, but it's so far away. I think this is why Paul gives Timothy those ordinary, everyman examples of patience in the text that we read. Each, the athlete, the soldier, and the farmer, each of them in their own way suffer. Each of the vocations requires patience. The soldier's patience is his submission to the commanding officer. He surrenders his will to that of the other soldier. The athlete. The athlete has to submit his body to a regime of exercise and discipline. He also has to submit himself to the rules of the contest, Paul says. And the farmer. The farmer has to conform himself to the very land, to its topography, to its climate, to the inner workings of the plants and animals that he husbands. True power in these ordinary examples is waiting. It's submission to the will of another. It's a recognition that it is God who is doing the work and not me. Be strong, Paul says to Timothy. Be empowered, Paul says to Timothy. Empowered in the grace of Jesus the Messiah. Our power comes as grace. Grace, of course, is another word for gift. And gifts aren't taken, gifts aren't made, they're not created. Gifts are received. We wait for them. Which is why Paul keeps talking about suffering. Share with me in the suffering of the gospel, he says, according to the power of God. God, he says, who has saved us and called us not according to our works, but according to his purpose. And his purpose is nothing less than the recreation of the world. The new creation, the restoration of all things built on peace and justice, a restoration founded on this new conception of power. A power which is not the power over, a power to control, a power to do what we want, but it's the power to be for another, the power to submit to each other. As Paul says elsewhere, the power to bear one another's burdens, the power to esteem the other more highly than we esteem ourselves. True power. It comes through service and humility. And Timothy has been empowered to live out this new life in his own ministry, to tell others about it, and to train new leaders to proclaim this good news. The tradition that is being handed over from Paul to Timothy, and then from Timothy to the next generation in Ephesus, is the idea of a God who hands himself over. He hands himself over to the Father on the cross, completely 100%, not holding anything back. Paul, likewise, hands himself over completely to his enemies, and he's thrown into jail. Timothy, if he stays on course, may very well suffer the same fate. Can you do this? Can you hand yourself over? What about to your spouse? To your kids? To your friend? Can you hand yourself over to your boss? Can you hand yourself over to that really annoying guy at work? What about to your enemy? Can you give yourself fully to them, even if it kills you, believing in faith that your life will be given back to you? This is the gospel of the resurrection. Be empowered in the grace of Jesus, knowing that it is not your strength, but the power of God working in you. It's scary to put ourselves in the hands of someone else. Certainly our enemies, but even sometimes of our spouse, of our kids, of our friends. It's frightening to put ourselves in the hands of someone who we may not fully trust. Even more so in the hands of someone we may not really like. It's frightening to contemplate failure. frightening to lose. Yet God has not given us a spirit of fear, Paul says, but a spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. We're not given control of others or of this world or even of our own lives, as many of us know. We're not given the power of Artemis. We don't get to do what we want, and we certainly can't do it on our own. But what we have been given, the grace that we have, is the power of the resurrected God, the Messiah Jesus. We're given the power of grace, the power of gift, the power of love. May God bless the hearers and doers of his word.